Welcome to Life Astrologer, and I have a wonderful astrologer with me today, Nicola Allsop, who does wonderful work with fertility astrology. Welcome, Nicola.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I was looking at your chart, and I was thinking that there's a very emphasized 12th house with Saturn, Chiron, and the moon in there, all in Pisces, and Pisces rising as well. So what do you make of that? What do you feel that does for you?
Well, in the context of fertility, what I find really interesting about, well, firstly, you can't see it. I think you can't just see the moon, Saturn, Chiron conjunction. I think you have to then drag in the Pluto, Uranus, Mercury, Jupiter, the cross. It becomes part of that grand cross. And because it's all in Pisces, and Pisces is the angles, for me, it is terribly angular and quite, it becomes like really quite emphasized in my life, I suppose. But one of the biggest questions in fertility has been, will I ever have children? Will I ever fall pregnant? And as if fertility is, and the question is phrased as if fertility is a yes/no answer, as if astrology is going to say yes or no. And the really interesting thing is that fertility is not static. It changes, and it changes with your life cycle. It changes with your partners, because we don't get pregnant on our own. We obviously, join with other charts. But also fertility charts, as you know, can be contradictory because we are contradictory human beings. So a chart can be both fertile and infertile. So what I take away from my particular chart is, because the moon has got Uranus, Saturn, Pluto, and Chiron, if you like. I don't particularly use Chiron, but if you just add that into the mix, what you get is I've had two natural pregnancies very early on, both a bit of a surprise. So there's the Uranus, and then later I've had secondary infertility with a second husband. And there's the Saturn, Pluto, Uranus. So it's a case of like reading a chart and understanding that it's not either or, and that your reading can be contradictory, and to leave all options open, I think.
Yeah, and certainly, I think one of the, particularly when people are learning astrology, when I find that they start to begin to understand this idea of a chart not being static, is when they start looking at progressions, and then that's when I think I see people really beginning to think, oh yeah, the change within me, the chart actually shows the change within me. Because when I with my students, when they first start learning, they see the transits as being, yes, okay, that's phases, things changing. But I think they still think of it as more of an external event. Whereas with the progressions, I think they begin to see, oh yes, I change. I think it's very interesting to see that.
So I practice medieval astrology, and I have done for quite a long time. And the one thing that if you kind of have to immerse yourself into medieval thinking, and medieval thinking kind of goes along the lines of, to figure out a transit was really hard, because not everybody had an ephemeris with them. So astrologers did not have they had a vague idea, but they couldn't predict where those planets were going to be. So a transit was your last kind of technique that you used. The first technique that you would use is the Alcockadon, working out your length of life. The next technique that you would use is directing the luminaries, or the high leg. You'd work out the high leg, which is part of the Alcockadon algorithm, but you then work out the triplicity phase rulerships for your ascendant and for your main luminary. And then based on that, you could make a very averagely predictable statement about the quality of somebody's life, given the years that you already know that they're going to live. And so what I find interesting is that once you have somebody's chart, those medieval astrologers wouldn't necessarily have needed transits, because by perfection, if you step yourself around the chart per year, it shows you the different house emphasis and the different emphasis of activities according to each year. So when somebody is living a fifth house year, you must know that their emphasis is going to be on children, or the sale of their property, or getting some honorary degree, because those are all the extensions of what the fifth house, perfection could yield. And then we look at the planets that are in the fifth house or in the perfected year, and what other aspects do they have, and that gives us another layer of prediction. But we haven't even used an ephemeris yet, and we haven't even looked at a transit. The transit seems to be like the trigger. So if you wanted to go for the hair trigger or whatever, that seems to be it. But I agree with you. It's only when we have looked at our own charts, or we've experienced a full year of astrology, or even a couple of years, do we realize and understand the changing of the focus of our lives according to those sort of bigger cyclical techniques.
So I've been kind of glancing back at your chart, and of course you are a Capricorn. And, it's in the 10th house, and I think for me that just shows how hard you work and the high standards that you set for your work.
I do. I'm one of those very typical Capricorns. So if I pick up a hobby, I turn it into a business. So I started picking astrology up as a hobby, and then I turned it into a business. And with my double Pisces, and the moon in Pisces and Pisces rising, I'm soft touch. So if there's a problem or somebody wants something from me, of course I'm going to try and fix it, because that's what Capricorns do. And so there's a practical application to kind of seeing where people are in need. I do work hard, and I do have high standards for myself, and I suppose in extension for other people, but actually I'm less hard on other people than I am on myself. And I think that to work in the world of fertility, though, whether you're a Capricorn or not, because it's such a serious topic, you actually need to be really extra responsible and extra ethical, and it does demand of you that you are seen to be utterly professional at all times. I have to sometimes deal with medical doctors, and I exhibit sometimes at the Olympia at medical fertility shows. So I'll take a stand at a medical fertility show, and it's about never getting into slanging matches with doctors, never losing your cool, never being polite, finding a way to find common ground with them to create more collaborative possibilities than just shutting them down into a them and an us. So my work has really been to take astrology out of astrology and take it into the world, and to negotiate a bridge for that. And sometimes the bridge requires a bit of compromise, and not all astrologers will understand my take on it. But because I did a master's in narrative medicine, and because my focus is on understanding properly all aspects of the placebo effect, I found that by introducing myself as the most sophisticated placebo, doctors were then willing to speak to me, because then I could give their academic criteria for placebo back at them, and those criteria happen to fit well with what astrology can and does do. And so I created a bridge. And so now when I do have a lot of friendly doctors and a lot of friendly people in those circles who are not threatened, and they're not either put off by the fact that I'm trying to claim that astrology is a science per se. So it's really interesting with that 10th house sun in Capricorn, that I slowly, and I've been doing this for quite some time now, I've slowly built something that is quite solid, and something that is quite, how can I say, very measured and a conservative approach.
Well, I think the Pisces helps there in the sense that you know how to, how should I put it? I was going to say play the game, but I don't mean it in that way. I mean it as being knowing how to adapt.
No, I've just chameleonized myself.
Exactly, that's it.
I know, and I've kind of entered into the medical profession like a little subversive lizard terrorist, and I've actually just, started a movement within, which then I can't stop. But yes, it is about, if you dress like a doctor in a white jacket and you go into those things, it's amazing how and who first actually flashed on that was Galen's. Galen's actually taught, he said, if you want to look like a doctor, you have to dress like a doctor, which means that your garments must be clean, and they must be tidy, and your desk where your workspace must be orderly. So Galen's already knew that like half the thing is faking it. So your patient actually requires you to look like you have confidence in yourself, and inspires confidence then in them, which I find really interesting.
And in this case, we're not just talking about your patients, we're talking about the medical profession,
yeah.
Which is a much harder nuts to crack, I think.
Yeah.
I also, of course, and listening to you as well, you're talking about narrative and the importance of narrative. That's so Pisces too, the story, the emphasis on the story as well.
I wonder. I think that's sort of maybe my Jupiter in Gemini coming into its own, but and also the Mercury in Sagittarius. But I feel that the Pisces, and also I've got a direct, and the tightest aspect in my chart is a Neptune trine to the Moon. So my, and sorry, to my ascendant. So my ascendant's 21-21, and my Neptune is 21-21. So what I find is that when we are faced with making a prediction, one of the limiting factors for astrologers is that they don't have a rich enough imagination. So in order to make any kind of prediction, you've got to have a full handbag of goodies to choose from. So you've got to have a full range of interpretations. You can't just have a narrowed down version of 5. So my imagination and my ability to literally, that Pisces thing, put your finger in the matrix, tap into the whole wide world. I come up with the most weirdest, wonderful stories, and I sort of I put that back into the interpretation. And some of those weird and wonderful stories have been my miracle charts. They've been the things that have really worked, because instead of limiting myself, I've actually opened it up to all interpretation, and without judgment either. So I think that's a function of the Pisces, is just understanding that the more of an imagination you have, the more you can bring to the reading too.
Yes, I can certainly understand that. And you're right, when we're making predictions, we do have to imagine different possibilities for how the story will unfold. And it can't be prescriptive, as in it's going to be like this. It's same things happen, to me, as I find that it's when I allow that imagination to think how could this unfold, that I make the most I guess precious connections, is the way I see it, because you're allowing your intuition to flow through as well, and perhaps opening up a more psychic side of Pisces.
Well, yes, there's that, but I also feel like in the way in which you phrase something to somebody is really important in light of the fact that we don't want to be sitting here predicting to passive people who then just passively come along and get the reading. They must move towards their own destiny, otherwise it's not their own destiny. So I find it useful to, and that's my emphasis on narrative again, is to tell a story. So it's when you're sitting with somebody who's got a story very similar to something else, is to just say, just like to stop here and tell you a story. And you tell the story, and they either step forward into the story or they step back from the story. And it's not that your story is incorrect or inappropriate for that time. You're just giving them the opportunity to engage with it or not. And I find that that's really helpful, because you're not telling them what to do, and you're not approaching it with a sledgehammer. This is the prediction. And there are no other things kind of, it's limited. Also, people who come to me are quite, how can I say, they're vulnerable in a way. They are have been taking many hormones, so they're not quite themselves. So you have to work gently around them, and they've had quite a lot of failure by the time they see me. These are not happy stories. So it doesn't help to give them necessarily false hope, although that's a wonderful topic for another lecture. You don't want to lead them down, any garden paths, but you do want to be able to give them the best that astrology can offer, and that is, I just tell a story that has got, this happened with somebody with a similar signature, and this happened to her, and so you invite them to take up with it or not.
Absolutely. It's one of the best tools I find in working with clients as a therapist or as an astrologer, is to tell stories, because it leaves things open. It allows people to think and process and make their minds up. It's a wonderful, wonderful way to work. So this is a really nice insight into the way that you work and the way that you think, just by looking at your chart. And I'm looking forward to doing the podcast interview with you, when we're going to talk more about the detail of how you work. And I'm going to put the link to that on the notes to this interview. And Nicola, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, how would they go about that?
Well, they could just Google astrology and fertility, and they'd probably find me. But I do have a website at www.fertilityastrology.com.
Wonderful. I'll make sure the link is there for that as well. Nicola Allsop, thank you so much for joining us on Life Astrologer today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
You've been watching Nicola Allsop, and I am next week going to be speaking to more wonderful people. So I hope you will join me then.